So a few months ago, I published a soft sourdough sandwich bread, and so many of you have made that recipe and loved it, but I've also gotten a ton of requests to make a whole wheat version. So that's what we're going to make today. We're going to make a honey wheat sourdough sandwich bread, and as always, you can find the full written recipe linked down in the description box. So I always measure everything by weight whenever I'm making sourdough. It's the best way to do it, and I also find that it's a lot easier than using volume measurements. So that's what we're going to do here, and we're going to start with our water. So we need 650 grams of water, and you want this water to be slightly warm, around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 35 degrees Celsius. And next we need 300 grams of active fed starter. So I actually fed this about 8 hours ago, and because we need 300 grams, what I do is I take 50 grams of starter, I feed that 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water. That gives me 350 grams total starter, which means I have 300 to go in my dough and 50 left over for the next time I want to bake. So after you measure your sourdough starter in there, go ahead and stir it up a little bit in the water to kind of get it broken up. Next up, we need 680 grams of bread flour, and I really like to use bread flour for this recipe because it's going to help give it a nice strength with the whole wheat flour. Whole wheat flour can kind of be difficult to build a strong gluten structure with, so this is going to help us along. So 680 on the bread flour. So then we need 320 grams of our whole wheat flour. And that ratio is going to give us a really nice whole wheat flavor without having a bread that's super dense. It's going to stay really light and fluffy. On top of that, we need 50 grams of either a neutral oil or really soft butter. And this is what's going to help keep our sourdough really nice and soft. A lot of sourdough recipes don't include any fat, and those types of recipes tend to be really chewy and crusty, but this is going to give us a really nice soft loaf. And then, of course, because we're making honey wheat bread, we need our honey. So we need also 50 grams of honey. And this is not going to make an overly sweet bread. It's going to give just a nice mild sweetness and that amazing flavor of the honey. And our last ingredient is salt. We need 20 grams of salt, and you can use kosher salt or fine sea salt, whatever you have on hand. Now I should mention that these amounts are going to make a full batch of bread dough, which makes actually 2 loaves of bread. So if you prefer to only make 1 loaf of bread at a time, the written recipe does give amounts for a single loaf batch. But what I like to do is to make a full batch and bake one of the loaves the day I make the dough, and then put the rest of the dough in the refrigerator to bake once that fresh loaf is finished. So you kind of always have this rotation of fresh bread. So when I put that other loaf in the oven, then I make another dough and put that in the refrigerator. And you can actually keep this dough in the refrigerator for up to 4 days, and the flavor actually just keeps improving with time. It's a great way to give you some flexibility with your baking schedule, and I love having it always on hand. I always like to start mixing my dough with a rubber spatula until it kind of starts coming together, and then I really get in there with my hands to finish mixing it. So what you want to do is really get in there with your hands and almost kind of squeeze and massage the dough. You are really trying to make sure that all of the flour is hydrated, all of the salt is evenly combined, and everything is cohesively combined. I find that a lot of people just do not mix their bread dough quite long enough. You probably want to take about 2 full minutes to do this process, and you can kind of fold your dough over itself and really just get in there and squeeze it together. We're not kneading the dough, we are just mixing the dough. There's really no getting around getting your hands quite messy and sticky when you make sourdough. It's just part of the process. You gotta embrace it. Once you give that at least 2 full minutes of mixing and you can tell that all of the flour is really well hydrated, we're going to scrape all of the dough off our hands. If you don't have one of these bowl scrapers, they're so handy to scrape dough off your hands. And then we are going to let this rest for about 30 minutes before we do our first round of stretch and folds. That's going to let the flour completely hydrate and also kind of give the gluten a little bit of a jump start on starting to get formed. After about 30 minutes, you can come back in and do your first round of stretch and fold. So this process is going to build our gluten structure. This kind of takes the place of kneading a bread dough because this bread dough is a much higher hydration than bread doughs that are kneaded. And so it's super sticky. It would be really almost impossible to knead. So what you're gonna do, take your hand and get it wet because wet hands do not stick to wet dough. And you're going to pull the dough up from underneath and stretch it as far as you can without tearing it, and then fold it down over itself. Then you're gonna turn the bowl and do that same thing, going all around the bowl until it starts kind of tightening up into a ball. So this first round of stretch and folds, it's going to still feel pretty weak, like you can't stretch it very far. But when you come back and do your next rounds, you'll see that it strengthens as it sits, because time is one of the things that helps build gluten. So once it looks like it's kind of holding more into a cohesive ball than it was before, we can go ahead and let this rest again. We're going to give it about another 20 to 30 minutes and we will come back and do our second round. It has been another 30 minutes, so we are going to do round 2 of stretch and folds. This is just the same process. We're going to get our hand damp again. Go ahead and grab underneath the dough, pull it up and stretch it over itself. It should stretch much farther this time, and each time you do this, the dough is going to feel more extensible and more stretchy. We are going to do this a total of 4 times. So 2 more times after this, and between each round, you want to give it about 20 to 30 minutes. That's going to give the dough time to let the gluten relax a little bit and continue letting it naturally build. After round 4 of your stretch and folds, go ahead and cover your dough again. And then you have 2 options for your bulk fermentation. If you want to bake your loaf on the same day, you can let it sit at room temperature for about 3 more hours until it is full of air and rounding in the bowl. I'll show you what it should look like here in just a moment. But if you don't want to bake this today, you can put it in the refrigerator for up to 4 days. It does need to be in there for as little as 24 hours to really start developing some flavor, but then you can go for up to 4 days. The day that you are ready to bake your loaf, you're going to want to pull it out of the refrigerator and then let it sit for 5 hours at room temperature to let it warm up and finish bulk fermenting. I have a dough here that I made earlier and it is finished bulk fermenting. Now this is a half batch of dough, so this is only a single loaf, and you can tell here that it is filled with air. If you give it a little shake, I can tell that there's quite a bit of air in there, and I can also see that it's rounding in the sides of the bowl, which is a really good indication that it has fermented well. So we can go ahead and shape this. I'm going to lightly flour my counter and turn this out. Now, anytime you are shaping any bread dough, you want to make sure that most of the flour you're putting out is just getting on the part of the dough that's going to be the outside of the loaf. You don't want to get too much flour on top. If you get too much flour on the top of the dough, that's the part that's going to be folded in on itself to shape it. It won't stick to itself very well. So you want to be careful about that. So I'm going to kind of pull this out into roughly a rectangular shape. And I'm just going to very lightly kind of press the air out of it. And now we can start shaping it. So I like to use my bench knife as kind of an extension of my hand. It really helps shape the dough. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start on the side that is the farthest away from me, and I'm going to pull it out and give it a little bit of tension and then bring it in towards the center. And just lightly use your fingertips to kind of seal that. And now we're going to do the other side, the side closest to you, and kind of pull that out and then bring that in and press to seal. And now we're gonna do each other side that we haven't done yet. So right side, pull it out, fold it in, and then my left side. And that kind of gives us this fat little log. So what I like to do to finish shaping this is what is called stitching. So we have a seam down the middle here, And what I'm going to do is kind of take the dough and sort of crisscross it over itself to really tighten it up into a tight log. But it's really sticking to my counter right now, so I'm gonna give myself a little more flour. And now I can do my stitching. And it's pretty good to get your hands kind of floured when you do this so you're not sticking too much. So I'm going to just grab each side and kind of pull it in and over itself so that it's building this really nice tension. And that's going to help it stand really nice and tall when it goes into the loaf pan. And then you can kind of pinch the ends to get that seam kind of pinched together. And if you have any big air pockets, you can pinch those as well. Once you have formed your dough into a nice tight log, you can go ahead and put it into your loaf pan to proof. I like to give it a nice little spray with nonstick spray, just to help make sure it doesn't stick when you're going to turn it out of the pan later. And then we're going to turn this seam side down into our loaf pan. And then I also like to take my hand and kind of gently press down on the dough to sort of make sure that there's no air pockets stuck in the middle and to make sure it's kind of evenly filling out your pan. Now we're going to cover this loaf and we need to let it proof or rise for the second time. So at room temperature, which is about 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius, this should take about 2 to 2.5 hours. If your room temperature is much cooler than that, it's going to take longer than that. Or if your room temperature is much warmer than that, it's going to move much quicker. So you do want to keep an eye on it. We're watching for this to crown the pan, and I'm going to show you how to check the loaf to see that it is fully proofed. While your dough is proofing, about 30 minutes before it looks like it is done, you do need to prep your oven. So what you're going to do is put a baking stone on the center rack, and then underneath that you want to put a metal roasting pan and fill that with about 2 cups of really hot water. Then we're going to preheat the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 205 degrees Celsius. This is going to give your oven a really nice steamy environment, so when you put your bread in, it's going to help it get a really nice oven spring. I have a loaf here that is finished proofing, and I want to show you how to check if it is finished. So what you're going to do is flour a finger, and you're going to do what I like to call is the dent test. So you're going to gently press in on the loaf about a ½ inch in, and we're looking for how quickly this dent fills in. If it immediately pops up in less than maybe 1 or 2 seconds, then that's a good indication that you need to give it a little bit more time. I can tell that this is really slowly filling in. It's been maybe 5 or 10 seconds and it's still very slowly filling in. So that's a good sign that I have got a really nice proof on this dough. Now, if I press in on this loaf and it never fills in, or it feels like it's going to collapse, or it even does collapse, that means you've gone too far in your proofing process. You can still bake your loaf, but your gluten structure is starting to become really weak and you're probably going to have a really dense loaf, so you do want to keep an eye on it. Now we're going to go ahead and bake this, and in addition to that steamy environment we made in our oven, I like to get the top of the loaf a little bit damp. If you have a spray bottle, that's perfect. Or if you don't have a spray bottle, I like to just get a little cup of water and just kind of flick water over the top of it. It's going to help it kind of jump up and rise really nicely in the oven. All right, we are going to go in the oven with the steam for 15 minutes, and then you want to remove the steam pan out of the oven and let it continue baking until it is fully golden brown. It's going to take about another 20 to 25 minutes after that. And when I pull that steam pan out of the oven, I like to put a towel on the oven window, because if that water spills on the oven window, it can actually shatter it. So it's a nice little insurance policy to do that. To make sure that your loaf is finished baking, you can kind of give it a thump, and it should sound hollow. Now, if you can't tell, or if you're a little bit unsure, you can stick a thermometer in the side of your loaf and you're looking for 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees Celsius. Now, as soon as it comes out of the oven, you do want to tip it out onto a cooling rack, because you don't want the loaf to steam in your loaf pan. That's going to give you kind of a soggy crust. And then I really want to encourage you to try to wait to cut into this until it is completely cool. I know that's literally the hardest part of this process. Everybody loves to dive into hot bread out of the oven, but if you cut into a full loaf of bread that's still hot, it's going to release a lot of steam, which is going to make the loaf stale really quickly, and it can kind of give you a gummy texture to your bread. So you're going to get the full flavor and texture if you just be really patient and let it cool. I really hope you love this recipe, and if you try it, please let me know what you think. And as always, you can leave me any questions you have down in the comments section. I always try my best to answer them. And make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a video, and I'll see you back next time with another recipe tutorial.